Okay, you press go live. Okay. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihare Gopi Janavalabha Girivaradhare Gopi Janavalabha Girivaradhare Yashodanandana Braja Janarandana Yashodanandana Braja Janarandana Yamuna Tira Vanachare Yamuna Tira Vanachare Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihare Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihare Gopi Janavalabha Girivaradhare Jaya Gopi Janavalabha Girivaradhare Yashodanandana Braja Janarandana Yashodanandana Braja Janarandana Yamuna Tira Vanachare Yamuna Tira Vanachare Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Srila Prabhupada ki, Grantara Srimad Bhagavatam ki. Can you maybe shift my chair a little bit?
Yeah.
That's a little better. Okay, thanks. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. We're reading from the second canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, chapter 7, entitled Scheduled Incarnations. And we are taking a look today at text number 32. So 72732. Gopermake pratihate vraja viplavaya.
Gopermake pratihate vraja viplavaya.
Deve vivarshati pashun kripahari rakshu.
Deve vivarshati pashun kripayari rakshu.
Darto chilindramiva sapta dinani sapta.
Darto chilindram sapta dinani sapta.
Varsho mahidramanaghayka kare shalilam.
Varsho mahindramanaghayka kare shalilam.
Gopermake pratihate vraja viplavaya.
Gopermake pratihate vraja viplavaya.
Deve vivarshati pashun kripayari rakshu.
Deve vivarshati pashun kripayari rakshu.
Darto chilindramiva sapta dinani sapta.
Darto chilindram sapta dinani sapta.
Varsho mahidramanaghayka kare salilam.
Varsho mahindramanaghayka kare salilam.
Please repeat. Gopermake pratihate vaja viplavaya. Deve vivarshati pashun kripayari rakshu. Darto chalindramiva sapta dinani sapta. Varsho mahidramanaghayka kare salilam.
Gopermake pratihate vraja viplavaya.
Gopermake pratihate vraja viplavaya.
Deve vivarshati pashun kripayari rakshu. Deve vivarshati pashun kripayari rakshu. Darto chilindram iva sapta dinani sapta. Darto chilindram iva sapta dinani sapta. Varsho mahindramanaghayka kare shalilam. Varsho mahindramanaghayka kare shalilam. Gopermake pratihate vraja viplavaya. Gopermake pratihate vraja viplavaya. Deve vivarshati pashun kripayari rakshu. Deve vivarshati pashun kripayari rakshu. Darto chilindram iva sapta dinani sapta. Darto chilindram iva sapta dinani sapta. Varsho mahindramanaghayka kare salilam. Varsho mahindramanaghayka kare salilam.
Gope by the coward men. Make in offering a sacrifice to the King of Heaven.
In offering sacrifice to the King of Heaven.
Pratihate being hampered. Vraja viplavaya for devastating the whole existence of Vrajabhumi, the land of Krishna's pastimes. Deve by the King of Heaven. Abhivarshati, having poured down heavy rain. Pashun, the animals. Kripaya, by causeless mercy upon them. Rirakshu, desire to protect them. Dharta, held up. Uchilindram, uprooted as an umbrella. Iva, exactly like that. Saptadinani, continuously for 7 days. Saptavarshaha, although he was only 7 years old. Mahidram, the Govardhan hill. Anaga, without being tired. Ekakare, in one hand only. Salilam, playfully. Translation. When the coward men of Vrindavan, under the instruction of Krishna, stopped offering sacrifice to the heavenly king Indra, the whole tract of land known as Vraj was threatened with being washed away by constant heavy rains for 7 days. Lord Krishna, out of his causeless mercy upon the inhabitants of Vraj, held up the hill known as Govardhan with one hand only, although he was only 7 years old. He did this to protect the animals from the onslaught of water. Purport. Children play with an umbrella generally known as a frog's umbrella, and Lord Krishna, when he was only 7 years old, could snatch the great hill known as Govardhan Parvat at Vrindavan and hold it for 7 days continuously with one hand, just to protect the animals and the inhabitants of Vrindavan from the wrath of Indra, the heavenly king, who had been denied sacrificial offerings by the inhabitants of Vrajabhumi. Factually, there is no need of offering sacrifices to the demigods for their services if one is engaged in the service of the Supreme Lord. Sacrifices are recommended in the Vedic literature for satisfaction of the demigods, are a sort of inducement to the sacrificers to realize the existence of higher authorities. The demigods are engaged by the Lord as controlling deities of material affairs, and according to the Bhagavad Gita, when a demigod is worshipped, the process is accepted as the indirect method for worshipping the Supreme Lord. But when the Supreme Lord is worshipped directly, there is no need of worshipping the demigods or offering them sacrifices as recommended in particular circumstances. Lord Krishna therefore advised the inhabitants of Vrajabhumi not to offer any sacrifices to the heavenly king Indra. But Indra, not knowing Lord Krishna in Vrajabhumi, was angry at the inhabitants of Vrajabhumi and tried to avenge the offense. But, competent as the Lord was, he saved the inhabitants and animals of Vrajabhumi by his personal energy and proved definitely that anyone directly engaged as a devotee of the Supreme Lord need not satisfy any other demigod, however great, even to the level of Brahma or Shiva. Thus this incident definitely proved without a doubt that Lord Krishna is the personality of Godhead, and that he was so in all circumstances, as a child on the lap of his mother, as a boy of 7 years old, and as an old man of 125 years of age. In either case, he was never on the level of the ordinary man, and even in his advanced age, he appeared a young boy 16 years old. These are the particular features of the transcendental body of the Lord. Om Ajnanaatimirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Gadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yutapadakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavangscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagunaragnatam Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padam Sahaguna Lalita Shri Vishakan Vitangscha Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurange Radhe Vrindavaneshware Vrishabhanu Sudadevi Pranamami Hari Priye Vansha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadara Shrivasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. When the coward men of Vrindavan, under the instruction of Krishna, stopped offering sacrifice to the heavenly king Indra, the whole tract of land known as Vraj was threatened with being washed away by constant heavy rains for 7 days. Lord Krishna, out of his causeless mercy upon the inhabitants of Vraj, held up the hill known as Govardhan with one hand only, although he was only 7 years old. He did this to protect the animals from the onslaught of water. So here Lord Brahma is continuing his summary overview, one could say, of the various incarnations of the Lord, and specifically spending quite a few verses to summarize the most essential pastimes of Lord Krishna while he was on this planet. The pastime of Govardhan Hill is one of the most important pastimes. We see that Govardhan Hill is one of the most important places of pastimes of Lord Krishna. And Govardhan Hill, for those of us who have been there, who's been to Govardhan Hill? Chaitanya has been there? Yeah. Oh, when you were young? How old are you?
16, 24.
Oh, wow, recently. Nice. So Govardhan Hill is a wonderful place. A very wonderful place, very mystical place. And it is a very special place, because Govardhan Hill, different places of the Lord's pastime will give you different benefits. Different places, they can give you different special boons. And Govardhan Hill can give you a special boon. Govardhan Hill, going to Govardhan Hill, you can, and if you want it, you can somehow become relieved from your false pride, which is very difficult in actual fact. Pride is one of those amazing things that can attack us even up until very, very advanced stages of spiritual life. One can be attacked by pride. We see that Lord Indra was not a bad person, quote unquote, and he was a devotee. He was fully obedient to the Supreme Lord, and he was actually very responsible and also extremely pious. It's not like to become the king of heaven, a living being has to have a great stock of pious activities, very, very pious. But the demigods, it's important to understand that the demigods are not necessarily completely pure. They are all still tainted by the desire to control and enjoy. But the difference is that the demigods, they are obedient, and they also understand their position, and they are responsible. So therefore it is important to understand that the qualification to become a demigod, to a certain extent, is piety, but also the willingness to take responsibility. So that willingness to take responsibility is the real category. And we can see in Krishna consciousness also, the same principle is there in our movement. It's not that our movement is necessarily composed of only pure devotees. It's also composed of people that are not necessarily pure, but what makes them, what qualifies them, is this the ability to take responsibility. The willingness to take responsibility is what allows one to also participate and take some position in the Krishna consciousness movement. But one should always be very careful, because the material world is so constructed that it facilitates the desire to be independent of Krishna. And the way by which it facilitates that desire is by the existence of this false ego. The world is constructed in such a way that it can facilitate your own pride. It can protect you from, it can facilitate you experiencing that illusion to a certain extent. And we see that the Bhagavatam is full of individuals who have somehow become overcome by that pride. Very easy, it can happen. So Lord Indra, in this instance, what happened is that there was a traditional sacrifice that was always made by the coward men of Vrindavan. And Krishna himself basically went to his family when he was seeing that they were preparing this big sacrifice, preparing so much ingredients, so much wood for the sacrifice, so much grain, so much milk products. And he was saying, what is this sacrifice? What are you guys doing? And then Krishna's father said that, well, this is our tradition. In the family we offer a sacrifice to Lord Indra because he is the one who provides rains. And because there is rains, therefore there is grass. Because there is grass, our cows can eat. So we are just paying our dues to him. And Krishna basically convinced him that said, what's the point of offering serving Krishna? Indra. Indra he is not God. He is just he is bound by the laws of nature to give us rain if we perform our duties. Just like in the city, for example, it's like there's no need for you to go to the Minister of Sanitation of the city of New York and directly ask him to come remove the trash from the front of the temple. He has to do it. If you pay your taxes, he is bound by law to come and perform that service. So why would you go to him and flatter him personally? It's not really required. So basically Krishna explained to his father that forget this, let us use all these ingredients and let us just directly worship Govardhan Hill. Because it is actually Govardhan Hill who is giving us the grass and giving us shelter for our cows. Let us worship the Brahmanas, let us worship the cows, and let us worship Govardhan Hill, because they are really the sources of our opulences. Let us show our gratitude to them. So they did that, and Lord Indra became very upset, and he then became overcome with pride, and he wanted to destroy the inhabitants of Vrindavan. And then Krishna protected these inhabitants by lifting up Govardhan Hill. And it is at that point also that Lord Indra could understand what is his real position. He could understand that, well, what have I done? Somehow I've been overcome by this pride. And then he went to Krishna to ask forgiveness. And then Krishna asked him, he said, how could you do this? How could you try to destroy my family and my village, the place where I live? How can you do that? That doesn't make sense. And then Indra said, what can he do? He became angry. He lost his intelligence due to anger. And then Krishna said, yes, but that is not good. You should control your intelligence. No, you should control your anger. And then Indra said, I couldn't because I was so proud. So then it became clear that that was the reason. Somehow because he was proud. Therefore he became disconnected. Now, a few things important to understand. Firstly, that the pure devotees will also be the object of other people's envy, unfortunately. Everyone has to understand. In the beginning of Krishna consciousness, especially in this movement, one can sometimes become bewildered because you will see that certain individuals, they are at the receiving end of a lot of envy. And then one might think that maybe one might start to doubt whether these persons are actually proper. Maybe they are, maybe there is something wrong with them. You will see it. Generally, even if you Google Hare Krishna, you will get so many interesting things. Because there's many envious people that are very active on the internet. Because the internet is very easy. If you are envious, the internet can facilitate your envy quite nicely. Because it doesn't cost a lot of money. You don't need to. You can just sit there. You do a little, you know how to use WordPress, and then you're good to go. Yeah? Then you can just exhibit whatever envy is in your heart. So then you can Google, and I've seen it many times. People get into Hare Krishna and they Google Hare Krishna, and then they get all kinds of weird websites because there's a lot of envious people out there, and then you start wondering, wow, maybe there's something wrong with this. Why? How could a person, if he's really a saintly person, how could he be at the receiving end of so much envy? Yeah, why is that? So, well, we see it's not difficult to understand, because even here, the inhabitants of Vrindavan themselves were subject to the envy of Lord Indra, to a certain extent that they wanted to destroy their entire village and kill them. Yeah? So therefore one cannot just judge, one cannot say if a person is the recipient of envy, that one should not necessarily think something wrong with them. The irony is that that is the nature of reality in this world, is that when people do actually attain saintly character, and when people do sacrifice quite a bit for Krishna, they will oftentimes actually become the object of the envy of other people. And Prabhupada used the example of Hari-vilāsa Thakur and also Jesus Christ, who were both, Jesus Christ being crucified and Hari-vilāsa Thakur also being sentenced to death because of what? Because of simply trying to be a pure devotee, being a pure devotee. So that is the peculiar nature of reality in this world, that envy is such an amazing thing. It can be directed. Prabhupada calls it causeless envy. People can just, without real reason, desire to destroy another person. And a lot of it is rooted in the fact that people fail, even in spiritual life. People can try to practice Krishna consciousness, they can try to come to the spiritual path, and they will fail. And that failure they cannot absorb, they cannot deal with it. And then that failure then turns into envy, which is then directed to those people who are making a success, who actually shown that it is possible. So it is something to understand that this is the peculiar dynamics of the nature of the conditioned soul, which specifically then in spiritual life becomes greatly accentuated because the practice of Krishna consciousness is so intense. So therefore everything becomes more intense. You will see more intense ecstasy and you will also see more intense envy because there is this more, the stakes are higher and the intensity of the practice is higher. And it is a great austerity actually to be on the receiving end of other people's envy. I remember once my Guru Maharaj tells they went on a Harina, and then they just saw this thing flying from some apartment window, and it was a toilet seat. Someone threw them with a toilet seat. And then they were looking, they were thinking, my God, what's going to come next, you know? So it is very austere. If you go out in book distribution, or you go out and you represent God, I mean, you take that stand and you say, yes, I'm now representing the spiritual world, the message of God, and you then somehow become at the receiving end of other people's envy. It is very austere, in fact, very shocking, very painful. And the first time you might experience it, you think, well, I don't want to do that. Let me just become a normal person. Let me just go back to not representing God or spirituality. Why would I want to incite the envy of other people? But we see that that is one of the, Prabhupada calls it the thankless task of the preacher, is that one tries his best to be a representative of God's will within this world, and then you will have to then take also the envy that comes, because that is the unfortunate nature of life in this world, that the conditioned souls, they have that envy. So that is just something to understand, that that dynamic is also there. But we see that Krishna will protect his devotees. So that's the other thing. One will be protected. Krishna will protect us from whatever comes. If one is properly connected to his message, then the envy cannot touch us. And in actual fact, it is the experience of that envy that also helps us to overcome our own. Because you see how ugly it is. You can only really see how ugly envy is when it is directed to you. When you really realize, wow, what an ugly thing. Now, how to get free of this pride and this envy? That then is the more important question. Because for the aspiring transcendentalists, we see now, we can learn from Lord Indra that even greatly pious people, greatly exalted individuals, greatly responsible, they can also be affected by pride and envy. It's very difficult to overcome. And it is then also that one can worship Govardhan Hill if one has a desire to overcome this pride in the heart. And it is very difficult to overcome this pride. But if you would go to Govardhan, you would see that that's what people go there for. The real people, the real individuals who are there for the right reason, they're there because they have a desire to overcome pride, and therefore they worship Govardhan Hill. And it is, in fact, a great burden that is lifted off one's shoulders. If we can just abandon this pride. This pride is this thing we carry with us, we carry on our backs, and it is such a drag, pulling us down and completely limiting our ability to experience the wonderful ecstasy that there is in serving Krishna. if we look at CC, we see Advaita Acharya's appearance there is coming up, and you would read in the first, I think it's the 5th or the 6th chapter of the Adi Lila, where the position of the Advaita Acharya is explained. And then we see that Advaita Acharya is, in one sense, he's Mahavishnu, but then he appeared within this world as Advaita Acharya to simply experience the wonderful pleasure of serving Krishna, the taste of being the servant of Krishna. And he relished that. We see it even in his pastime, in his relationship with Lord Chaitanya. That was his position, very clearly the servant of Lord Chaitanya, and is very clearly very ecstatic about it. So that is the nature, is that he's showing that even those who are greatly exalted, there is the position of becoming a servant of Lord Krishna. It affords us great pleasure and meaning and ecstasy. But one cannot have access to that experience if one is still burdened with pride. Because pride somehow, it is like the salt in the sweet rice, as I can say. It's one ingredient that is added into the consciousness, and then it blocks one from experiencing the happiness of service. So, therefore this pride has to be abandoned. And we see that Krishna also makes arrangements. Because in this pastime, it was not just for the protection of the residents of Vrindavan that Krishna lifted this hill. It is also for the sake of Lord Indra that Krishna performed this whole pastime. Because he was a devotee. But Lord Krishna could see what was in his heart, and he made an arrangement for him to help him to overcome that pride. Now, one can, if one does it voluntarily, it becomes much less painful, in one sense. The more Krishna will help us, but the more heavier the pride, the more heavier the medicine, as they say. So to try to abandon it voluntarily, it really helps. And it's not so difficult. The easiest way to overcome pride, as Prabhupada said, simply by also, especially serving the Vaishnavas. It is there at that place when one can really abandon pride quite a bit. Because the Vaishnavas are very dear to Krishna. But it is very difficult to serve the Vaishnavas if one is infected with pride. Serving, we see that the Kanishta Adhikari, the neophyte devotee, he has faith in God, and he has the ability to serve God, so he can serve the deity. But we see that he is a neophyte because he does not properly understand how to treat the devotees. Because it is actually more difficult to properly worship the devotees than it is to externally worship God. Because God is very great. When you come in, it's easy to offer your obeisance, and God is very distant. So therefore, there's a certain sense of fear and awe and reverence that protects even the neophyte spiritualist. But in dealing with people, with saintly people, with the devotees, it is there that one's really becomes tested, one's ability to properly deal with the Vaishnavas. And it is there that if one is able to be properly concerned for their welfare and make sacrifices for their benefit, then one can be relieved from pride. And it is at that point that one can also actually really have a proper relationship with Krishna. Because that is the reality, that the external formal relationship that Krishna has, that the Kanishta Adhikari has, it's not really that deep, and they don't really understand what it means. So serving the Vaishnavas is a special means to do this. And this is also in one sense what Krishna showed when he said, well, who should be the recipient of this yajna? The brahmanas, the devotees and the cows and Govardhan Hill. So very fascinating how Lord Krishna can act for everyone's benefit. Whatever Krishna does is for everyone's benefit. And in this pastime, he acted as much for the benefit as Lord Indra as he did for the benefit of the residents of Vrindavan. But we see that the special faith of the devotees of Vrindavan is also outlined here. Because we see that Krishna was the one who convinced them to stop this yajna to Lord Indra. And it's for his sake that he did it. And then the result was that their entire village was almost destroyed. And they were submerged into great calamity. But even at that point, they did not abandon their faith in Krishna, and they did not think that Krishna gave them bad advice, which is a real strength of faith. That how far can one follow the desires of Krishna, and is one able to go through, one might have to go through certain experiences that feel very challenging, and one will second guess and think, wow, did I make the right decision here? And that will happen. But at that point one has to, if one's faith has to be strongly rooted in the belief or the understanding that by following Krishna's instructions, all good will ultimately manifest, even if there might appear to be some obstacles or challenge in the way. And that is the kind of faith that is required to be successful in spiritual life. And if we do not have it, we should then try to associate with those who do have it. Otherwise, one will be deviated from the path, and one will, instead of continuing one's worship of the Vaishnavas, the cows and the Brahmanas, one will take a step back and again direct his worship to some intermediary material figure, to somehow again placing one's faith and one's security in something within this world, thinking that this is where I will have my security. And one will again take a step back from advancing towards that transcendental platform. Okay, so a few thoughts on this wonderful Leela. We have a few verses left here on Krishna's pastimes in this chapter, wherein we get a nice overview of the main events. So look, some highlights of things to come. So let's hear any questions, any comments, contributions. Yes, Braj Mohan, Prabhu.
Just something really small.
Sure.
I was thinking of how austere or how difficult sometimes it is trying to share Krishna consciousness with others. Sometimes you feel like you're doing all this like austerity, you're going out, it's free coal, it's burning hot, this or that, all these, assault on the senses and stuff. And it's, it can sometimes seem like such a challenge that you start wondering, why am I doing this? And one interesting pastime I was reminded of, one disciple of Prabhupada went out with Vishnu Swami for Hari-Vilāsa in Los Angeles in the early days when Vishnu Swami was still based there. And they would go out regularly, but this was like really early days, so no one knew about devotees. They looked like Martians from another planet. Everyone was freaked out seeing them shaking. And they go to this one spot in downtown Los Angeles, and there was like a big building behind it, like a cafe or a restaurant or something. It was quite tall, and there was a bus stop right outside, so they'd be jamming on the street, corner, dancing, and the buses are coming by and blowing the black smoke right in their faces, and they're like, coughing. And then all the people are walking by and they're saying, get a job, and weird, so they're getting hit from that end, hit from that end. And then people from the top of the building, they drop cups of hot coffee. It would splatter over their devotees. And then one, Vishnu Swami, all this is going on, he's just trying to be absorbed in the kirtan and chanting. And then one guy comes by and he says, just go home, man. Vishnu Swami does hit back and says, I'm trying. So I thought that was like a nice example of, the devotee's determination. Trying to.
Yes, Nata Bharguranga, Prabhu.
Okay, I have a comment and a question. The comment is that, a lot of times, when I see the devotees distributing books, that's a big thing where, you can just perceive either other people's envy or your own pride or things like that. If you have too much pride, then it's going to be hard to, constantly deal with rejection. And one thing that I see the good book distributors do is that, they'll somehow just convert whatever's coming at them into a more positive mood. And then when that mood gets so big, then it influences everyone. And then suddenly you see all the book distributors just laughing and
Yeah, well, you will see. Well, firstly, the experience in Govardhan is practical. I remember we've taken a few times, maybe I think 6 or 7 times, we've taken people, students, groups of people to Govardhan. And ranging from people who were sort of knew what was happening, were into it, versus people that were very new and just wanted to go to India for a spiritual experience. And it was fascinating to see every time we went to Govardhan, we did the parikram. And it was always just such a trip, just always interesting obstacles and challenges and, so many. It was just always fascinating to see how at the end of that thing, sometimes it would take us like 8 to 9 hours to do one parikram. It's because we stopped at the very place, we made a whole day of it. But at the end it was the most amazing thing. People were so ecstatic because basically it was very austere and people would come and they're like, why am I doing this? Like, why am I walking 35 kilometers, whatever, 30 kilometers around this thing? And many people just did it because that was sort of, okay, that's what they're doing for the day. And it's not like, it's nice, it's pretty, but it's not like going for a walk next to the lake or a mountain. It's not necessarily such a touristy kind of site, and there's all these sounds, and there's the monkeys that come and harass you, but at the end it was fascinating. We've never had an experience of going around Govardhan. We would start close to Radhakund, and we would chant that one verse, the Govardhan Pranami, Namaste Girirajaya Shri Govardhana Namine Ashesha Klesha Nasaya Paramananda Daine. I offer my respect for the obeisances of the Lord Giriraj, who is the king of all hills. He is the origin of all auspiciousness and the destroyer of all suffering. Ashesha Klesha Nasaya. He kills all suffering. And it would be amazing. So we would start and we would chant this, and everybody would sort of excited about the day. And at the end, 10 hours later, we get there, and it's like, we're so tired, finished. But they're so ecstatic because you have to do that. You have to, even just to walk around Govardhan, you have to give up some of your pride. And this, the principle of circumambulation, what it means is that you accept that now something else is in the center. You are walking around that. You're not going on your walk. You're walking around this thing. You are walking around something. And if we would look at some of the sadhus there, you would see these people who do this Govardhan parikram, who would do like the Dandavat parikram. Can you imagine your mind? Like, what are you doing? You're just offering obeisances. People would go, either they do it obeisances, or sometimes they do 108 obeisances in one spot, and then they move on, and then 108 obeisances, and then they move on, 108. So you can imagine what do you attempt? What do you think is going to happen if you do? Why would you do something like that? Because every time you go down, you are prostrating yourself towards Govardhan. It means this is more important than I am. This is what I'm doing with my life now. I'm just going to offer obeisances. So the only way you can do that is you have to abandon your pride in order to gain to gain happiness from doing that. I remember I showed it once. I showed someone that video. When I just came back from India the first time, I was just so fascinated. I had this video of this one guy just offering obeisances, and I showed it to one of my friends, and he was like, "What? What a wasted life! God, what a waste of life! You just offering, bowing down every day for like years." So we see that that's the special nature also of Govardhan, that it is only those who abandon pride who can understand what it's all about. And going there also, it can be very challenging to live there. We speak to people who live there, very challenging place. It will force you again and again. Everybody who's lived there for quite a while, they know that that's the price you have to pay to live in the Dham in general, but specifically in Govardhan Hill. And as we say, the whole pastime is meant like that, to understand that either you will be one of the residents of Raj, which is protected by Lord Krishna, or you will be Lord Indra, who is purified by Krishna. So whichever category you fall into, whatever your participation is in that pastime, the principle is that your pride will be removed. So, very wonderful. And we see also that Govardhan Hill, it's explained that those who worship Govardhan Hill, they will also they become immune from snake bite. Very interesting. And why snakes? Because snakes are envious. They're the personification of envious creatures. Because a snake will bite you even though you don't do anything to it. It will just bite you. It is burning. Prabhupada explains that the poison, they are burning with envy. That's why they're filled with poison. So that consciousness. But if you worship Govardhan, you'll be protected. You'll be protected from the attack of snakes, from the attack of envious people. And that's reassuring. Because it's explained that there's nothing more dangerous than an envious person. A snake or an envious animal can be controlled, but the envious human, there's nothing one can do to stop them. Nothing that they won't do. So somehow Govardhan is so intimately linked with that reality in Krishna consciousness of abandoning the false ego. And if one goes there with that desire to say, yes, now I'll go to Govardhan and see if I can become free from pride, then one will have a wonderful experience. And in Govardhan also, one of the nicest, so many memories there, but once we took a group of people, and this one guy, somehow he went with us, but he was very new. Like, he just saw the ad, on Facebook or something, and then he's like, yeah, I want to go to India. And we were like, I don't know, this guy hasn't, like usually you take people who have spent a little time with the devotees, who knows the chanting, sort of knows a little bit what's happening. And this guy he just wanted to go, and he was very forceful. Very nice guy, like one of those intense people that just does skydiving, and it's one of these extreme sports people. And he was like, no, I want to go to India, and I want to have the real thing. I don't want to go like stay in hotels and stuff. I want to do the real grassroots experience. So we're like, okay. So he came with us. And then we were in Govardhan, and then at some point there's this part where there's the ear of Govardhan. You know that part? There's this little temple. So there's the ear of Govardhan. So we went there and said, yeah, this is the ear of Govardhan. So, somehow people they can understand it, they embrace it, even though it's so foreign. And then he went in there and he I don't know what he did. Afterwards he said that he prayed there, and it was the first time he felt that God heard him in that prayer. So people have these very intense experiences there, even though they don't even understand exactly what's happening. And it's so can be so foreign, but the place is very powerful. And so that is the interesting reality also, is that it is this pride that makes us feel separate from Krishna, and makes us feel that Krishna is not with us, that he does not hear us. And if one can simply somehow give up that pride, then also one will have this experience that Krishna is very close to us. So that also Govardhan is there. It is not just about the challenge of giving up the ego, but it's about that very wonderful experience of what happens if one does it. And that is one will feel Krishna personally present within the heart. And that is really the reason why we are practicing Krishna consciousness. If you're practicing for some other reason, then well, good luck. But that is the best thing that one can get from practicing this process. Anything else? Bhakta Eric.
Thank you for that wonderful class. I have a two-part question. First part is, I'm wondering if you could share a story or something that shows how you've learned this lesson as the vice president here at the temple, or if you've learned this lesson in your duties here.
Not yet.
Nothing that you can share about?
Yeah, well, I think that anyone who takes responsibility in the Krishna consciousness movement will have a similar experience. And I think that if you read the Bhagavatam and you understand the position of the demigods, then you see that that's basically what it means to take responsibility, Krishna's mission. It doesn't mean you're necessarily pure. You will sometimes see that people have challenges with management, and then they will attack you and say, oh, you're not a pure devotee. And they will point out your obvious impurities. It's very purifying when people point out your impurities. But then we see that's not really the philosophy, that's not really the principle. The principle is that because one is not pure, therefore the movement exists so that you can take responsibility. So you might not be pure, you might not be able to chant the pure holy name, or really just by the basis of sadhana be able to break through and have that transcendental experience, which is reserved only for those who have real love. But you have some piety at least, so you're able to be responsible. You know? Pious means that one is able to be responsible for some things. You have enough sense, a little bit of sense control, so you can be responsible for something. So the movement of Krishna consciousness actually allows people like that who are not necessarily pure, but they want to be responsible. They're willing to take some responsibility for something. And that responsibility is then the thing. If you hold on to that responsibility, then you will become purified. Then through executing what is required of you to fulfill your obligations, naturally in the course of that process, one will become purified. So that is the interesting feature of Krishna consciousness. And we see that many times, if you look at people who have, if you are struggling in your Krishna consciousness and you feel that difficulty to control the senses, difficulty to control the mind, difficulty to sort of connect with the process, the general, what I've seen mostly is it is that people that have not enough responsibility. If you don't have enough responsibility, then you are thrown back on your own mind and senses. Then it is up to you to control your mind and senses. On the basis of what? On the basis of your own intelligence? Well, good luck. And that's what I found the most interesting thing, to come in. In the beginning, one resists it, because especially men naturally want freedom. You see? Especially young men, you want freedom. And therefore we see that, we see even in the beginning that Lord Brahma created men, and then they were not getting entangled because they just stayed aloof. So then he created women, and then that was the end of that. Because it is interesting how the men want freedom, but freedom keeps them aloof. So then we see in Krishna consciousness, even when the first time when you enter this movement and you start taking some responsibility, it's a mixed feeling of pain. It's like sweet and sour, because a part of you doesn't like it, because you are basically reducing your freedom. The moment you take responsibility, your freedom becomes constricted, apparently. But then one realizes that actually this responsibility, it will save me. You know, this responsibility will save me, because this responsibility is like the pivot around which I can control my mind and my senses. And you look at many people and they feel they cannot control their mind, they feel they're hopeless, or they feel out of control, but they're not willing to take responsibility. So then, that is the interesting thing in this movement, just to understand. That is what I've seen in my own experience of getting involved also in managerial responsibility, that to have that understanding that this responsibility is not always going to be pleasant, but it will actually save one from oneself, which is the most dangerous enemy, is when you have too much of, when you're just thrown back onto yourself. And oftentimes we pray to Krishna, and I see people, we pray to Krishna, please Krishna, help me, but oftentimes that help is Krishna extends his hand into this world by giving us the opportunity to just take responsibility for some of his service. That is actually Krishna's hand reaching out to us, but we have to be willing to grab onto it. And it is at that point, that means one has faith. One has to have enough faith to see that this is not ordinary responsibility. Even though it looks ordinary, it looks like the same thing. It's about money, organization, time, like any other kind of organization works on that basis. But those who have faith that this is somehow a different kind of responsibility. And I've seen that what is nice is that if you do not need anything more for your purification than simply fulfilling the obligations of that responsibility. You don't have to concoct your own program for purification or austerity or whatever to improve nothing. You just simply have to grab that responsibility and see if you can fulfill it. And then so much of your own development will happen as a consequence of that, because you will be forced to become better as an individual yourself. You will be forced to abandon bad habits, because these bad habits will hamper your ability to perform your obligations. So that is actually how purification takes place. And in the modern world, you will see that, especially in the Western developed world, most people are ruined due to a lack of proper and adequate responsibility. And even people with great privilege, they degrade themselves because they just don't have any reason not to degrade themselves. They're just killed by comfort. So that is something that is very apparent. Specifically, even, I mean, South Africa is also a little of that, but America, obviously, the height of comfort and the height of people having the ability to just live with very little responsibility. But then the consequences of that is just degradation. And we see that many people, like there's some people like Jordan Peterson, whatever, there's some YouTubers out there who are tapping into that thing, and people love the message. They understand, okay, I have to have some responsibility. But then it is only the movement of Lord Chaitanya that can give you a real responsibility that is really meaningful. That will allow you to really transcend your own limitations. So that is one of the things I've learned, and also taking up a little bit of responsibility in the Krishna consciousness movement. Okay, second part.
Thank you for sharing. That was an extremely helpful answer. And my second part was, what do you see as the significance and potential of New York, and specifically this temple and its role here?
Well, that's an interesting question. Well, I think that the Krishna consciousness movement, just like any movement, goes through different phases. I think the first part of our movement was a group of people that sacrificed most of their life to to gain resources for the Krishna consciousness movement. So the first, like to build these buildings, people sacrificed their lives to pay for these properties. And it's like Prabhupada had nothing, and then at the end he had all these temples and properties and resources, and that was only due to the sacrifices of people. It's like it didn't inherit it. Whatever arose, it arose by the sacrifice of a generation of devotees. But that sacrifice also came at a great price. And we see that now the movement, in one sense, certain things, we're also becoming more socially developed. We're realizing that, well, we have to also take care of people. Like people sacrifice, the movement has to see what we can do to take care of them. We also see the temples, many temples. The reality is that many temples are either empty or they have all these properties, not really much happening. Because at a certain point, Prabhupada said, he told one of his disciples, he said, now I want you to go preach at the universities. It's because my only shortage now is I need some first-class men to take responsibility for this mission. Because even if you have a $60 million building like we have here, if there's no people, first-class people, meaning people that have some capability and some ability to do things, if they're not willing to come and take responsibility, then nothing will happen. Then the rats will just take over and the building will collapse. So we see that now, I think, the movement, in one sense, there's a new generation of people, like we have here Chaitanya, an exemplary, like a person that has grown up in Krishna consciousness, but now is also looking for his place. What will he do for Lord Chaitanya? So we have an interesting time where there's a lot of young people that are coming forward and saying, well, we also want to give it a shot. And now these young people have the benefit that we don't have to sacrifice our life to build a building. We don't have to, but we now can do something with it. So in that sense, every generation inherits something from a previous generation, but then they have to do something with that inheritance. And in that way there is progress. Like for example, just look at it. You are, same most of us here, if you're from a European background, you can read about at a certain point your ancestors were barbarians. They were like, living somewhere in the wasteland of Europe, just pillaging and killing one another. And, that was it. And then through thousands of years of generational practice of spirituality becoming civilized and culture, now we live here in what a wonderfully, in all this technological civilization. So, but it is due to the result of one generation passing something on to the next generation and the next generation using it. And I think that now, specifically in America, many places we see there's a younger generation stepping forward, they're willing to take responsibility. And I think that New York City, to a large part, we have seen somehow is becoming a focal point for that. There's a lot of young people that are coming here, people who are willing to do stuff, looking for some employment, looking for some service, some position in Krishna consciousness. I can do something, but you have to get, just like if you want a job, there has to be a vacancy. So New York City, for all that it is, for all its own challenges, it is a temple full of vacancies, full of opportunities for those who are willing to come and say, yes, well, I need some, I have some energy, I want to do something for Lord Chaitanya. Well, here's your chance. It's not easy, it's like a frontier kind of experience. Not all the facility, the systems are not yet in place, but it attracts people who are willing to be innovative and people who are willing to start at the bottom and give it a shot. So that's what I think the future of this place will be, with a younger generation coming in, specifically also under the guidance of also older, very experienced people who've seen and done a lot and who are able to work with young people, because that's also very rare to get the older generation who are able and willing to work with younger people. So when those two things come together, there's a great recipe for success, and it will allow us to, in one sense, take things further. So one generation sacrificed their life for the property, for the place. Now the question is, what will our generation do with it? And I foresee, hopefully, in the next few years, the ability in a place like New York City to have a project that will be able to really connect with broader society to a large part because of people doing some interesting things. That is the hope. That is the hope. Let's see if it happens. Okay, it is now 9 o'clock. We have to take breakfast. Grantara Srimad Bhagavatam ki, Srila Prabhupada ki, Gaur Premanande.